American government, how are you guys doing today? Well, it is May 4th through May 8th. This is the final week of of instruction for our class. So this is the last lecture you're going to hear from me for government. And if you're a senior, then right now this is the final lesson we will have together. And then that's it. Next week's testing, and the week after is the last day of school. So if you're a senior watching this, I'm going to miss you a ton, and it's been a great year. And if you're a junior, then it's sad that government's ending now, but at least we have probably next year U.S. history. But yeah, our last lesson together for seniors, so crazy stuff. Today, I hope that you guys have been enjoying this. I've done my best. I've never taught online, and here I had the whole Q4 plan out to be heavy discussion based. We were going to have tons of debates and discussions in the room, so I've been doing my best to make this as interesting as I can. I hope that you guys have enjoyed it. But and honestly, the issues we're talking about, I hope that this helps you when you go off to college or whatever you do after this. I'm hoping that'll help you see the world better, that you can think critically, and be able to have informed opinions on how to vote and understand the economy and our nation. So the last one I wanted to talk about is minimum wage. This is something that you'll probably hear about your whole life. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to define minimum wage, and we're going to differentiate federal and state laws on it. We're going to discuss generally what conservatives and liberals believe on it, and then we're going to allow you to make an informed opinion. So that's what we're going to be doing for this pretty short lesson. Okay, so what is minimum wage? Well, in a nutshell, minimum wage is the lowest per hour wage that an employer can pay its employees. So let's say, for example, keep it really easy for a second. Let's say the minimum wage is $10. Okay, and McDonald's then, when they hire people to work, they have to pay them at least $10 an hour. They can't pay them any less, or it's illegal. Now, McDonald's can pay more than $10 an hour, that's fine, but they can't pay less. That's what's called a price floor. A price floor means that it's the limit of, or that the pay at least has to be higher than that floor. The federal minimum wage is currently $7.25 an hour. What that means is that the federal government has made a law that all states in the union must at least all states must at least have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. That's the federal law. States can't go below that. Now, states can have their own higher minimum wages, though. Like Missouri, for example, our minimum wage is $8.60 an hour. I know, and by the way, not even just states, even cities can make their own rulings on this too. The city of Seattle in Washington State recently said that they passed a law saying that there's going to be a gradual increase to $15 an hour for minimum wage, which is huge. So the point being that the federal government, again, remember, we're a federalist system, right? So you have a central government with its own power and states with their own power. So the federal government has said all states must at least have $7.25 for their minimum wage, and some states are doing that, $7.25. Other states like Missouri are higher than that, though. So that's minimum wage in a nutshell. Now, when you look at this on the right and the left, right, then you're going to see some obvious differences. People on the left, liberals, or you could say statists, typically more the Democratic Party, they're going to be much more in favor of minimum wage and much more in favor of higher minimum wage. And I'm going to do my best to explain both sides here as objectively as I can. But the liberal side would say this. Ever since the Civil War ended and the Gilded Age came into being, remember the Gilded Age when in the post-war United States, you had all these booming industries, Standard Oil with Rockefeller, or Carnegie's steel empire, and several others. And basically you had this crazy disparity between rich and poor start forming, where you had rich business owners and you had factory workers who weren't making a lot. And then so back in that age, you started to have the rise of unions, right, and labor unions, like the AFL, Samuel Gompers. And then up through the early 1900s, you had the progressive era, where even more power is given to the government and more discretion. Well, in the 1930s, FDR passed the first minimum wage law. And ever since then, it's been law in this country that there has to be laws in place. There needs to be a price floor, again, for wages, for wage earners, rather. So the argument, though, of why we do this or whatever is because they want to protect the poor. The idea is that if businesses could get away with paying 25 cents an hour to people, they would. If businesses could get away with paying $1 an hour, they would. That businesses want to pay as little as possible to maximize their profits, and that's not fair, especially for the poor. So the liberal position is that this minimum wage and a reasonable or even a high minimum wage is going to alleviate poverty. It's going to greatly reduce it, and it's going to help people all be able to make a living wage. That's a buzzword to hear, is a living wage. That if you're flipping burgers at McDonald's, you should be making at least enough money to live reasonably and support your family. On the economic side, another argument from the left is that you have lower turnover rates when you have a good minimum wage. What that means is when people are making enough money and they're doing well, then they're less likely to leave that job. They're less likely to go look for other jobs or whatever. So when they're staying in that same position, the business can, I guess you could say, maximize its efficiencies because they're not wasting days and hours having to train new people to fill positions as they turn loose. So the argument is that if you have real cheap wages, that people are constantly coming and going, and so businesses lose a lot of efficiency, and therefore can actually charge cheaper prices because they're being more efficient. So lower turnover rates is a pretty big argument from the left. And then government subsidies making up the difference. Let me explain this. Basically, if you have a situation with no minimum wage or a low minimum wage, then what the argument is that businesses will pay, a little bit to their employees, but they're not making enough to survive, so the government steps in to help. The government gives people food stamps, there's welfare, all that kind of thing. And so what happens is businesses can get away with paying cheap wages because our tax dollars are allowing it to happen in the first place. Because again, businesses are paying a few dollars an hour, and then the big government steps in to pay people for food and welfare. So businesses are being enabled to pay lesser rates because the government's helping, and they think that's not fair. So that's kind of the basic position from the left. Again, the further left you are, the higher the minimum wage you want. If you're more closer to the center, but you're on the left, you're probably going to say, well, we need at least a reasonable minimum wage at the federal level. Okay, how about the conservative position? Again, this is going to be your libertarians, your Republicans, and others. If you go to the far right of the spectrum, you're going to say no minimum wage, federal or state. But as you get closer to the center, you're going to say you're going to have a minimum wage, but it's going to be reasonable. It's going to be lower. And you'll probably have on the conservative side an emphasis more on states making their own minimum wage rather than the federal government, which I'll explain why in a second. So the number one thing to understand with the conservative position is that the argument is that minimum wage hurts efficiency overall. And I'm going to skip to this next slide for a bit and I'll come back. But if any of you ever take economics, let me move this up a little bit. If you take economics, you're going to see this kind of a thing. I love economics. I think it's fascinating. I'm hoping that one day I can teach economics actually at our school because I like it so much. It's the only math I actually enjoy, by the way. I think it's actually really fun. But here's the basic model, okay? And so track with me on this. So you have supply and you have demand. Okay, supply is how many of something are available. Demand is how much is wanted of that thing. So in this case, it's employment, it's workers, right? So where you see the X in the middle here, where it meets up, this is what's called market equilibrium. If there were no government controls, then this is where supply and demand would naturally meet. Now, let's say the government says, hey, we're going to raise the wage, is the wage, right? We're going to raise the wage up $3 an hour. Honestly, the numbers don't really matter much on this graph, but just follow me. Let's just say it's $3 an hour. So it goes up to this level, right? And you can see here that you create a problem. You create a disparity between the lines. Okay, this is the green is the most efficient, the red is an inefficient system where you have minimum wage raising up the wage to a price floor above equilibrium. So let's go to this chart now. So this is where minimum wage is, right? You see that the X is right here, this is the line. Well, this little quadrant here is called deadweight loss. Basically, you see the difference between the supply and the demand, right? That what happens is the supply of workers goes up and the demand for workers goes down. So businesses, when all of a sudden they have to pay more money, then they're not able to hire as many workers. But on the other side, now that when people hear, hey, you can make money now, you can actually make $3 more if you go flip burgers, now more people want the jobs. So more people want the jobs and there are less jobs available. So that's what creates what's called deadweight loss in the economy. Firm surplus and you have worker surplus. This refers to surplus means more than, right? So you have money that could be spent and you have workers that could be working. And this, so again, it's just tons of inefficiencies in the economy. So the conservative position again is that the more you raise the minimum wage, the more deadweight loss you have, which means that again, the less jobs available, the more workers who want those jobs. If you were to raise all jobs, for example, to $100 an hour tomorrow, a lot of people would want to work all of a sudden, right? because hey, who wouldn't want to make $100 an hour? But the businesses that are trying to, make profit, like, oh my gosh, I can't afford to pay my workers. I have $100 an hour. They'd probably cut most of those positions down. But again, now you have few jobs available and a lot of people wanting those jobs. So that's the whole point of this, is just to illustrate it in a graph sort of form. Okay, back up here. So that's what I mean. It hurts efficiency. The conservative position doesn't like how minimum wage seems to create fewer jobs and create a demand for create a supply of more labor and kill the demand for jobs. Another thing is the conservative position would say, and I wrote this incorrectly, sorry, that minimum wage actually not reduces poverty, but increases poverty, sorry. The idea is that like when you have a business that's paying fixed rates, then like you don't have as many jobs available. Like I just showed in the graph, that you're creating higher demand, you're creating higher supply of workers and you're lowering the demand for workers. So that actually increases poverty, obviously. Another point that gets overlooked a lot, and this is Thomas Sowell is a black economist. I'm a huge fan of his, and he said this a long time ago, that you actually promote racism and discrimination with minimum wage. Again, the higher it is, the worse. And one of the videos I'm going to have you watch is going to explain it, I think, pretty well. But basically, when you have minimum wage put in place, then what happens is that employers all of a sudden don't have as much competition with the other businesses around them to have to hire the best workers, or to hire the workers that would be less desirable. What happens is, when there's fewer jobs available and there's more people who want those jobs, what typically happens is the people who are more at risk don't get picked for the jobs that are available. It's just the sad truth. Let's say that you own a small business. Are you going to pick up somebody who doesn't speak very good English? I'm sure they're pretty good at what they do, but they don't speak the best English, right? Or are you going to pick somebody who's more reliable, who's healthy, who speaks good English? Are you going to pick a single mom in her late 50s who doesn't seem to be very healthy? Or are you going to pick a young person who's probably less risk for your company? What happens is, again, discrimination becomes a problem because you're able to pick and choose who you want and leave out the people who are probably more vulnerable, who probably need those jobs more in the first place. Thomas Sowell has a really good chart showing how in the postbellum or the after-war South, that black people actually outnumbered whites in employment for a short period of time. But when minimum wage laws got put in place, you start to see that completely turn around, where businesses who didn't want to, for example, hire black people could get away with it. Because again, you're increasing the worker supply and cutting the demand to make discrimination more affordable. Okay, another argument from the right. Federal wage does not take state differences into account. $15 an hour means a lot more in, for example, Montana than it does in California. California is astronomically high to live in. The cost of living is not that high in other states. So it seems kind of silly to say that all states should have to have a $15 minimum wage. So when you see, like, I'm going to show you in a second here that the Democrats in the House recently spearheaded a bill called Raise the Wage, and they want a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour. But the Republicans would argue, okay, maybe that makes sense in Seattle, maybe, but that certainly does not make sense in Alabama or in Montana or in a state that has a lower cost of living. And the last point from the right is kind of a response. If you go back to this slide for a second, the lower turnover rate, that liberals would tend to argue, well, when you have fair prices in place and people are less prone to leave jobs, the conservative argument would say that that's actually not true. What happens is the jobs that are more skilled are going to get paid more money. In any system, whether you have minimum wage or not, if somebody, the more skilled and technical the job is, then the more you want to keep the right person in that position. So you want to keep them happy with higher wages. So you would actually, there's not a lot of turnover when you're able to pay more money to those people. The conservative position would argue that minimum wage does is it forces you to pay more money to those who are not that qualified or not that skilled. So the people who are more skilled, who really deserve more pay, are going to be drained of their pay in order to pay for the less skilled workers. So ultimately, it actually hurts turnover for the more skilled positions. And frankly, the low skill positions, there's not much training that goes into it in the first place. If you're going to flip burgers, it doesn't take that long to learn how to do that. So that's the liberal and the conservative positions. I hope that makes some sense. I know we're going through a lot, but email me if you have any questions. Now, I just mentioned this a second ago. The House of Representatives, which is dominated by the Democratic Party, recently passed a bill called Raise the Wage. And I'm going to play this really quick so you can see the difference here between the right and the left on this issue.
On this vote, the yeas are 231 and the nays are 199. This bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
In the greatest country on earth, nobody with the dignity of a full-time job should suffer the indignity of not being able to provide for themselves or their loved ones.
The Raise the Wage Act gives up to 33 million Americans a long overdue raise. 33 million Americans.
This bill would increase the minimum wage gradually. This is not a bad for business piece of legislation, as my colleagues across the aisle allege. It's a good for everyone bill.
Mr. Speaker, a rise in opposition to H.R. 582, the Raise the Wage Act, or as it should be called, Raising Unemployment for American Workers Act.
You know, I think it's laughable for anybody in this House to say that the government's going to raise your wages. Government doesn't raise wages. What the government does is provide an environment for businesses to raise wages, and that's where the decision should be.
This bill would cause disruptive job losses and harm entry-level workers in many regions around the country, effectively knocking the bottom rung off the career ladder and especially hurting young workers.
Okay, so there's a sample of some clips from the whole thing, but just so you're aware that the Senate, so we talked about how bills get passed. It passed the House, but now it needs to pass the Senate, but the Senate won't even really consider it. The committee looked at it and said this will never pass, so don't expect the Raise the Wage bill to pass. Maybe if you get a real strong Democrat lead in the Senate, maybe, but that's a pretty big undertaking on their part. So anyways, okay, the last thing is what's your take? So here's what I want you to do for the discussion this week is now that we've talked about minimum wage, tell me which position here you hold to. You can put one not listed to, maybe I missed something here, but on the forums, on the discussion this week, tell me this. Do you think there should A, be no minimum wage, period, state or federal? B, do you think that there should not be a federal minimum, but that states should have complete control and just not have any restrictions in the federal government on it? 3, do you think that the states should have control, but we should have a reasonable federal minimum wage? That's kind of like where we're at today. Or 4, do you think that there should be a high federal minimum wage and states must comply? So states lose more control and not the federal government gets to tell what the wage is going to be. So tell me what your position is. I'll be interested to hear, and make sure you lay out your arguments for me because I want to see, how you're processing this. Well, for this final week, you guys, so you watched the lecture, kudos to you. I want you to watch CNN 10 and leave a comment. And by the way, again, if you're a senior in this class, this will be your final week of required viewing of CNN 10. So don't get too emotional during the Friday music because it's a big deal. It's just, this is the last time you're going to see it. And then life goes on to college or the workforce, wherever you go. But watch CNN 10 and leave a comment, discussion, so give an initial post and 2 replies to your classmates. Watch the required viewing, and I have a worksheet again like we did last week. And then lastly is study for the final. I'm going to put a study guide on here for you guys to look over. Listen very closely. You have to take my final on Wednesday, the 13th of May. It's not like I normally just give you the whole week to do it, but for this, it's the school's rules, it's not really mine, that every class basically has a day to do a final, and I'm not wanting to encroach on other people's time, so you're going to get a limited time to do my final. Just make sure you study ahead of time so you can just jump in and knock it out. It'll take you some time and it's going to be worth a lot of points, so make sure that you really know how to defend your positions and know your points. So, well, last lesson, you guys. Love you guys to death. If you have any questions, let me know. And I'm going to post one more video just kind of summing up history for the end of the year for all my classes. But for now, I will talk to you later. See you guys. And by the way, congratulations to the seniors, the class of 2020. It's pretty awesome.